Welcome to the webinar, How to Be an Influencer, What It Takes to Shape Organizational Culture. I always love at the beginning of these webinars seeing where all of the attendees are joining us from. My name is Elissa Tucker, and I'm joining you from St. Louis, Missouri. I'm a remote worker for APQC, and I head up the Human Capital Management Research Program at APQC. And today I'm also going to be joined by my colleague, Vlachos, a writer and researcher in research services at APQC. So today's webinar is going to be based on two APQC research projects on the topic of organizational culture. First, Than is going to start out telling you about the work that we did to document APQC's organizational culture. And then I'll talk about why we continued to research organizational culture and why we expanded that focus beyond APQC to look more broadly at how organizations can shape and shift organizational culture. Next, we'll look more specifically at what organizational culture entails and which levers shape organizational culture. And then we're going to conclude today talking about things to watch out for because they can undermine organizational culture. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Than.
Welcome everybody again. I saw people joining from all over the United States, from the Philippines, from Australia, South Africa, Poland. Thank you so much for joining us on this webinar. We really value your presence here today. My name again is Nathaniel Vlachos. I go by Than, and I'm a writer and researcher here in research services at APQC. I earned a PhD in cultural anthropology from Rice University in 2017, and I've been working with APQC since 2019. So I'm really excited to be here today to talk about a really cool opportunity that APQC gave me to put my anthropologist hat back on and help APQC study organizational culture. So in many ways, when we ask the question, why organizational culture, we started with ourselves and our own culture at APQC. All right, the very inventively named APQC Culture Project was a professional development project that I did to explore APQC's culture and think about methods for studying organizational culture more broadly. So I'll talk briefly about the impetus for this project, the methods that I used, some high-level findings, and then how those findings shaped our broader research on organizational culture. So in a lot of ways, the APQC Culture Project starts with our founder, Jack Grayson. APQC's culture is deeply shaped by the legacy of our founder. Senior employees had really formative experiences with Jack. They learned important lessons about work and life from Jack. They have happy memories that they continue to talk about today and tell stories about. This picture on the left is a picture of when Jack Grayson went skydiving for his 90th birthday. He also went skydiving for his 75th birthday. So he was a real character and he was a real visionary, but I also found out just what a compassionate and really down-to-earth person he was. He really got us started on the right path. And the challenge for our culture is that Jack passed away in 2017, and new employees, including myself, don't know Jack. We didn't work with Jack. We didn't get to have those formative experiences with him. So some questions I really brought to the project then were, how do new employees understand or think about APQC's culture? If Jack isn't the one shaping that, then who or what is? And then secondly, how do new employees learn about Jack? How do they learn about his contributions and legacy? And by the way, if you don't know Jack, you can read about him on our website and learn more about him. He had a really storied career history even before APQC. So just a little bit about the methods for this project then. The study of culture is, studying culture is really about seeing the human experience unfold in all of its messiness and complexity. And it's also about how humans come together in groups to make meaning. So for that reason, there's something about culture that you can't fully capture through something like a benchmark or a performance measure. There are different methods that you sometimes need to use to really get down to the nitty-gritty of culture. So some of the methods I used for this project included interviews with new and senior employees. I looked at artifacts and archival materials from APQC's organizational history. So things like this block of text up here in the left-hand corner, that was a document that Jack typed up to outline a tour of our building. And he really explains why the building looks the way it does, the philosophy behind some of the design elements. So things like that were important to look at. Also, sources that allowed me to study our digital culture, things like center-wide emails, social media posts that all employees were involved with. Those were really important for looking at our digital culture, which we all know has been huge for the last couple of years, a really important part of organizational culture. I also observed rituals, some of our key rituals, our annual events that we do and things like that, and just daily life in the organization. And then just more broadly, participant observation means that I'm a trained cultural observer. I'm a cultural anthropologist by training, but I'm also a participant in this culture. I'm a regular APQC employee. I report to a manager. I have assignments I need to finish. I can let those experiences and my implicit knowledge of the organization's culture really inform how I'm interpreting what other people are saying and what I'm observing. So broadly, this group of methods together are known as ethnographic methods. And ethnographic methods are used often by researchers in scholarly as well as business contexts to study culture. So ethnography is also used, for example, in the user experience research space, in research and development, to really dig into how a customer experiences a product or a service. You might even have ethnographers walking around the halls of your organization, so just be careful. But ethnography is definitely out there in the business world. So those are the methods that I used. Some high-level findings now from this project, including one about a Twinkie. Just one of the biggest things that I found really was how Jack Grayson really laid a foundation for a culture of generosity and warmth and genuine care for employees. And the Twinkie story is a great example of the kinds of connections that Jack made with people. So one of our senior employees narrates the story of the time that Jack surprised her with the gift of a Twinkie. And she wanted to just leave that Twinkie at her desk for years, decades even maybe, to see what would happen with all the preservatives in there. She said it might still be just as fresh. And I think a part of her just wanted to keep it because it was from Jack and she really loved Jack. But at the end of the second paragraph, the last couple sentences, she says, the Twinkie mysteriously vanished one day. She didn't know what happened to it. And she says, but I don't have my Twinkie anymore. And that made me so sad because it was his memory sitting right there at my desk. It really showed how he was in friendship with people. So I feel like a lot of senior employees at APQC have their own version of the Twinkie story, some moment where Jack really connected with them, mentored them, encouraged them. Collecting those stories was a really important part of not only studying our culture, but like saving those stories so that when people like Becky leave the organization, we can still learn about Jack. We still have those stories. Some more high-level findings, though. Another thing I explored was really just how our current leaders at APQC today who worked with Jack, they really did experience Jack's compassion, generosity, just down-to-earth nature as a leader. They really extended that and continued that culture once they became leaders. When APQC started, it was a really hard-charging business environment in the 70s and 80s. And You know, it still is a hard charging business environment in many ways, but I think our leaders today really brought some work-life balance to the table, more family-friendly policies and things like that. So I talk about that in the report. I also think that APQC's history and even today holds this productive tension between chaos and structure. I think like many visionaries, Jack was kind of a chaos figure that comes with new ideas and disrupt things. So he went around starting lots of little fires, metaphorical fires, of course, and people came behind him to either put out those fires or grow them in productive directions. So the leaders that really rose up around Jack, I think, added the structure and the sustainability that allowed us to carry out our mission well and to be able to keep doing that. Another really important part of our culture that I learned about was freedom as one of our most important values. That was really important to Jack. That was behind a lot of his ideas about productivity and quality and efficiency. This image on the right-hand side of the screen is the cuneiform symbol for the word freedom. It's one of the earliest known written expressions of the word freedom, and this is on our wall in our office building. It was really cool when I talked to some of our newer employees. I didn't ask them direct questions about freedom, like what does freedom mean to you, or are you free as an employee? But those themes of freedom really came out when newer employees told me about the ways that APQC just lets them use their creativity to experiment, try new things, and try out things that might add value to APQC. We have the freedom to do that, and this APQC culture project is definitely part of that freedom as well. And then just more broadly, you know, our rituals, artifacts, pieces of our organizational culture, stories, all of those things are really important for teaching new employees about Jack and about APQC's culture. So the project was about preserving those things and putting them in one place. I just want to talk a little bit then about how this might be relevant to you and your organization, what kinds of things you could use these methods for. Ethnographic methods really do allow researchers to gather stories and narratives, artifacts and rituals that do lead to really fine-grained insights and analysis about culture. So sometimes you really do have to drill down to that more social and relational level with people to answer a specific question about your organization's culture. And I think these methods can be really effective for that. I think ethnographic methods are especially good for smaller groups or teams or departments. Maybe you're trying to answer a question about departmental culture or team dynamics. Why is the finance function acting this way? Where are these behaviors coming from? Let's get to the root of this. Ethnographic methods can be really good for exploring a slice of your organization's culture. On the other hand, if you're wanting to get a read on employee engagement across 11,000 employees, you still could use ethnographic methods, but I think an engagement survey or a pulse survey is going to it's going to help you answer that question much more quickly. So I think that if you're looking at cases like that, ethnographic methods may not be as effective. That's not to say I definitely don't want anyone to leave the webinar feeling like if you're in a large organization, you can't use ethnographic methods for something, you absolutely can. It's more about the scope of the questions that you're asking about culture and whether things like interviews and firsthand observations are appropriate for the scope of those questions. So these methods can be effective no matter what kind of organization you're in to answer those questions about culture. It is a more relational, on the ground kind of view. So you'll just need to think about that as you think about whether these methods are appropriate for you. So I just want to close this part of the presentation with a few thoughts about how this project, the APQC Culture Project, and those methods really shaped our broader research on organizational culture. I think that one thing we definitely learned is that those first-person narratives, storytelling, observations from employees could provide deep insights into culture. And we carried that into this research. Our cultural influencers report was shaped primarily by interviews and conversations rather than a traditional survey. We did around 15 interviews with experts and culture practitioners in some of our member organizations and some of our friends and partners. Those interviews provided really good insights about organizational culture. And then another really important thing we did was a series of roundtable conversations about topics related to culture. So representatives from member organizations gathered to talk about topics like the intersections between process management and knowledge management, and what happens when those groups come together, the clashes that might happen, the cultural misunderstandings. We did a roundtable conversation on the people and culture of process improvement. We did one on the intersections between knowledge management and diversity, equity, and inclusion. All of those are available for you to read in our research library, but they were really really neat opportunities for our members to come together and tell the story of their organization's cultures to each other and talk about effective strategies that they found for shaping culture. So we really thank our members for doing that. That was really huge, really important for this project. And for that reason, I think this cultural influencer support really is a co-creation between APQC and its members. I tried to reflect that as I wrote the report by pairing a quote from one of our members, one of our roundtable participants, with each conversation throughout the report to show that we're not just up here in an ivory tower studying culture. This is what we're hearing from our members. So what did we hear from our members? Elissa now is going to talk about the culture conversation more broadly across organizations, and then review with you some of the findings.
Great. So as we were conducting the APQC culture research project that Than just talked about, we were seeing interest, as Sam mentioned, in organizational culture pick up. And we're seeing this interest continue today. For example, articles with the word culture have become commonplace in the business media. The word culture is showing up in a range of job titles. For example, some companies are changing the chief HR officer job title to chief people and culture officer. A new C-suite position, chief culture officer, has even emerged, as have top companies for culture lists, like the one from recruiting website Comparably. And I think a number of factors are making organizational culture a hot topic. So let's talk about some of those. So first, the evidence continues to mount showing that culture can be good for business. And we're going to talk about this a bit more in a moment. Second, culture is believed to play a critical role in organizational change. And it seems that every organization today is undergoing some kind of change. And then third, culture is a component of organizational social responsibility, which is itself a hot topic today. Are you familiar with the term cancel culture? When society withdraws support from people who've done things that aren't accepted today? Well, cancel culture has made its way into the business world. Business leaders who act in ways that make an organization's culture toxic are being canceled. Toxic cultures are thought to be a driver behind another recent phenomenon, the Great Resignation, where high numbers of employees are resigning from their jobs, really searching for more supportive and more rewarding work experiences. So while toxic cultures are thought to drive employees away, respectful and empowering cultures are thought to be a key component for holding on to employees today. And finally, interest in organizational culture seems to have risen since the onset of the pandemic. As remote and hybrid work have become increasingly common, organizations have grown concerned about how they will preserve their cultures. So because we were seeing interest in organizational culture, we set out to better understand what culture entails and how it can be shifted as well as sustained. So as Thea mentioned, our cultural influencers research included interviews with culture experts and practitioners. In addition, it included a series of roundtable discussions with our members. And I want to share with you in their own words, some of the ways that our research participants define organizational culture. So a conglomeration of biases, prejudice, and experience based on the organization's history, the environment people are working in through which they complete their work together, a mindset and set of behaviors, the way we do things around here, visible norms and behaviors, for example, communication norms for email. And I have a final quote that I think sums it up very well. A shorthand way to describe all of the social contracts, both explicit and implicit, that guarantee how we engage with each other, make decisions, learn from our decisions, and move toward our strategic objectives. So culture is about how we engage, how we make decisions towards strategic objectives. So these participant definitions aligned very nicely with how APQC defines organizational culture, which is the ingrained social norms and beliefs of an organization. It comprises values, belief systems, leadership styles, collective unspoken assumptions, stories, and rituals, as well as the organization's character and orientation. So the participants in our cultural influencers research talked not just about what culture entails, but also about why culture is important to their organizations. And I want to read a few quotes that illustrate the themes we heard from participants regarding the importance of culture at their organizations. Culture is important because it's the agreed upon mechanisms for how we engage with each other in the work we do. Cultures shape, reflect, and represent prevailing expectations, norms, and behaviors, and in turn are shaped by systems, processes, rules, policies, and structures. Their importance lies in the way they enable or disable a healthy organizational life to play out. And finally, if we create a culture where employees can thrive, grow, and develop, they're going to take care of our customers. That is going to impact our bottom line, help us to be successful, and sustain what we're trying to do long term. So enable or disable a healthy organizational life, take care of customers and the bottom line, sustain the organization over the long term. So for our participants, organizational culture is much more than a hot topic. It's a source of positive impacts that yield positive outcomes for a number of stakeholders. For example, as I mentioned earlier, there is growing evidence of the positive or link or the positive organizational outcomes that come from an organization's culture. To give you one example, James Heskett, a former faculty chair of the MBA program at the Harvard Business School, has done research that has found that healthy, effective organizational cultures are associated with employee loyalty, productivity, and creativity. There's also evidence, however, showing the negative impact of having a poor culture, an ineffective culture. So organizations are also looking to understand how they can turn around or ward off poor cultures. One of our research participants is an expert in organizational culture, and he has done some great work to quantify the impact that a poor culture has on organizations from a financial standpoint. And I want to talk about his findings for just a moment. So This individual's name is Nick Shepard, and in his latest book, The Cost of Poor Culture, he argues that an organization pays a price in at least three ways when it has a poor culture. So first, there are financial surprises. These include fines, penalties, or losses that occur when unplanned or unexpected behavior creates an unexpected financial impact. Second, there are hidden costs, and these arise when disengaged employees form dysfunctional relationships that ultimately lead to wasted resources that ultimately lead to an impact, a negative impact on the bottom line. And then third, there are lost opportunities, as disengaged employees mean less collaboration, less cooperation across silos, and this translates into lost opportunities to drive things such as customer satisfaction or continuous improvement. So organizations have strong reasons to care about culture, but they aren't alone in their interest. Employees care about culture too. A quote from one of our research participants illustrates the value that employees find in healthy organizational cultures. This participant shared with us, "I had the CEO call me directly when one of my kids was born, asking how my wife and baby were doing. Having executives model that behavior and culture is key. It gave me a sense that they're not just saying we're a family company. You can tell from their behavior that they do see it as a family, and that makes you want to belong." So especially right now in the era of the Great Resignation, employees are seeking to work in organizations with positive cultures, and they're increasingly willing to switch employers in search of cultures that support them as whole individuals and that provide them with opportunities to do meaningful work that is valued and also well compensated. So as a result, we're seeing those top companies for culture lists popping up. But these kinds of lists are not only playing a role in attracting and retaining employees, they also can play a role in attracting and retaining customers. Oop, go back one. There. There we go. So whether they're of the consumer or the business variety, customers today want to do business with organizations that do good. So companies that treat people and the environment well and that make a positive impact on society. Today's customer is also looking for a high level of responsiveness and personalization. And research is showing that customers are more likely to find these high levels of service from employees who work in companies with engaging cultures. So positive organizational cultures are important for business performance, employee attraction and retention, and for attracting customers. There's also an increasing interest among investors in organizational culture. So investors have seen the research on the power of organizational culture. And as a result, they're requesting and in some cases demanding information about organizational culture to help them make their investment decisions. So in response, we're starting to see some organizations post culture reports on their websites. And these are reports that share information on the organization's culture. So for example, engagement and turnover rates. And they're also sharing information about the activities that the organization is doing to sustain or to improve organizational culture. So given the power of a positive organizational culture, I want to take a look at with you at what we learned from our participants in the Cultural Influencers Research Project regarding what levers can be used to shape organizational culture. Okay, so participants pointed to foundational elements of organizational culture. And some of these we heard about from Than in the context of the APQC Culture Project. So an organization's vision, its mission and values, they shape everything from strategic priorities to the type of people that are hired to how employees behave. They also shape how leaders behave. And leaders are another foundational part of organizational culture. Leaders shape culture because they're highly visible and they're responsible for strategically driving the business. They communicate the importance of culture. They model desired behavior, and they also provide resources and support that can be used to strengthen or to change organizational culture. In addition to leaders, HR also plays a foundational role in culture. Many, if not most, HR activities can reinforce or change culture. And I know we have many HR professionals attending the webinar today. So I want to take a moment and look more specifically at some of the ways that HR shapes culture. First, HR shapes culture by ensuring policies and procedures reinforce cultural expectations. One participant shared the following with us regarding shaping and sustaining culture. You do need to think about policies and you do need to think about rules, regulations, and performance objectives. Second, HR shapes culture by crafting an employer brand and employee communications. So branding and communications, they're ways to showcase an organization's desired culture. And then third, HR shapes culture by ensuring that talent sourcing and selection criteria support the culture and to some extent support functional subcultures. One participant explained to us, a person might have all the right technical skills, but if I don't see things that support our culture, they're not going to get hired here. HR also shapes culture through training and development. Onboarding in particular provides valuable opportunities for new employees to learn about an organization's culture. Onboarding opportunities that can impact culture include tours of the workplace that explain the intent of the layout and the significance of the decor. Training materials that teach about the organization's history, mission, vision, and values. And then meetings with peers who will explain and then also model routines and norms. HR also shapes culture in designing leadership development. This involves establishing core behaviors for managers and leaders, and then training and assessing managers and leaders on these core behaviors. Goal setting and performance evaluation are additional ways that HR shapes culture. Performance goals set expectations for behaviors that support the organizational culture, while performance evaluation establishes accountability among employees for performing their roles in ways that align with the desired culture. So I'm going to talk about 3 more ways that HR shapes culture. First, HR shapes culture through promotion practices and decisions. Employees pay close attention to who gets promoted and why. Promotions send a powerful, often implicit message about the behaviors and capabilities that get recognized, especially when these aren't aligned with an organization's explicitly stated values. One of our research participants explained, if you're in an organization for any length of time, you can watch who's getting promoted. And based on that, you learn how to behave. It's not necessarily about the mission statements, but instead about the behaviors that lead to success. Second, HR shapes culture through recognition and rewards practices. So recognition and rewards practices communicate important messages about what an organization truly values, and they're effective ways to drive the kinds of behaviors that an organization wants to promote. And then finally, HR shapes culture by carrying out and acting on employee listening. In particular, employee surveys and focus groups are key ways to identify cultural discrepancies, because employees are keenly aware of those areas where an organization's desired or stated culture is not being lived every day. Sorry about that. There we go. So we also have process improvement and knowledge management professionals attending the webinar today. And a number of knowledge and process professionals participated in this research, sharing about the role that culture plays in their work. And I want to talk a little bit about this. One of the process professionals in our research shared, culture is foundational for whatever you're doing in terms of continuous improvement or new initiatives. If it's not aligned with the company culture, it won't make sense and everyone will be running in different directions. A knowledge management participant advised KM teams need to dig deep into their organizational culture and its many subcultures to understand what prevents people from sharing and reusing knowledge in various teams, locations, and scenarios. So essentially, process improvement and knowledge management professionals are cultural influencers. Inspiring and guiding others to action is key to realizing their objectives. To give an example, one process improvement manager told us, continuous improvement is one of our values as an organization. My role is to go and evangelize others about continuous improvement and how important it is for our organization, and provide them with the tools and resources that they can use in daily work to continuously improve whatever they're doing. Process improvement and knowledge management professionals are also cultural whisperers. They have relationships across their organizations, and their work gives them an inside look at why and how other work gets done in an organization. And so with this deep understanding, they're able to position the desired culture in ways that are meaningful and motivating to different areas of the business and to different groups of employees. One participant advised, start by acknowledging that you have multiple cultures at play, even if you have one ideal culture you're trying to move toward. Then you can start to identify how people in different subcultures align to that ideal culture and what you can do to get them to move towards that ideal state. So in addition to people and roles, organizational culture is also shaped by visible values, by the ways in which values are brought to life in organizations. Stories and memories are two ways that organizational values get communicated and reinforced. And as Than shared earlier, newer employees at APQC, their knowledge of Jack and his role in shaping the organization's culture, that's often derived through stories, through anecdotes, or observations from more senior employees. Organizational culture is also transmitted through artifacts and rituals. Artifacts tell a story about an organization's history and its culture. So for example, larger, more longstanding organizations often have large collections of old uniforms, logos, marketing materials, or other artifacts that speak to the organization's legacy as well as its tradition. And it's common to see these cultural artifacts displayed on the walls and in other areas of offices. Rituals also play a powerful role in shaping organizational culture. Explicitly as well as implicitly, they communicate an organization's values and they create a shared sense of meaning and purpose among employees and leaders. So award ceremonies, group volunteering, work socials, these are all rituals that shape culture in organizations. So we've looked at who and what shapes organizational culture. So let's take a look at what participants had to say about the ways they have seen organizational culture get derailed. So our first cultural derailer is failing to align the desired culture with the realities of daily organizational life. When this happens, employees become confused about what the culture is supposed to be, and they're more likely to resist attempts to shift the culture in productive directions. One of our participants explained, there's the culture that the organization or leadership espouses versus the culture on the ground, and those things don't always match up well. Especially when working to shift culture, it's important to think about what you are asking employees to do and how it might fit or not fit with their goals and how they get their work done. One participant advised, one of the things I think is really important is asking the question, what would this look like operationally? What would we be doing if we were doing things this way? Equally important is what would we not be doing? In other words, you need to make that bridge between what you say at the strategy level and the operational reality where people work every day. A second derailer is when leaders articulate a desired culture and consider their culture work complete. When attention and maintenance is overlooked, employees will revert to older ways of working, and your culture will mutate and shift on its own terms. One of our participants explained, if you don't maintain it, it will derail. You need to constantly keep up the messaging and have role models demonstrating the culture. Another participant noted, the thing that really upsets people in organizations is when leaders don't do as they say. If the policies and procedures that people are required to operate under or apply are inconsistent with what they're seeing from leaders, the organization loses credibility with employees. And another participant suggested if leaders model those behaviors, it will help drive employee alignment with culture. Frequently, culture change is pushed from the top down without input from employees. And as a result, employees are less likely to see how they can contribute to culture change. And they're also more likely to actively resist culture change. One participant told us, for me, culture derails when there's only one direction of communication, top down. Another participant noted, it creates mistrust when people feel things are being done to them and not for them. And another participant recommended enlisting skeptics and detractors in culture efforts. And this participant shared, when things blow up, some people aren't shy about talking. Those are the people you want on your team. They're not low performers. Often they're good performers that are vocal. Having those people as key team members has saved us in projects over and over again. They help identify the roadblocks you may not have even thought about. Organizations are also prone to overlooking the growth of subcultures. So when organizational subcultures are not kept in check, these groups, which hold different assumptions about ways of working, for example, they can weaken and even clash with the desired overall organizational culture. One of our participants explained, I think there has to be, from a value standpoint, a dominant culture. What is it that you're trying to do to succeed in your mission? Everyone needs to be driving toward that larger mission for the organization rather than local missions for their group. So to mitigate this kind of cultural conflict, bring in team members who are knowledgeable about the subcultures of each group to translate between them and highlight the common ground. It's easy to underestimate the amount of effort and time that's required to change deeply ingrained beliefs. And if you don't acknowledge this, then you're not going to be able, as an organization, to devote the resources and the time needed to show employees how the change will benefit them, and also to demonstrate actions that employees can take that will support the culture change. So one participant shared, the biggest pitfall that I see in my organization and in previous organizations is that leaders buy in and understand the benefits, but don't necessarily allow their teams to engage in continuous improvement. They don't allow the space or the time. It's one of the biggest barriers I face every day. Another participant advised that anyone impacted by change needs to be convinced that the change will add value, whether by making their process run more smoothly, producing better business results, or something else. The final derailer that I want to talk about today is failing to take stock of the number of culture change initiatives that are taking place at once within an organization. So organizations are often seeking to create cultures of X, where X can be anything from continuous improvement to process thinking to knowledge sharing. But too many cultures of result in a lack of a cohesive enterprise culture. So it's really important to prioritize, align, and pace various culture change efforts. So to sum up, when working to sustain or shift organizational culture, pay attention to how the behaviors you seek align with the way work is currently being performed and rewarded. Treat culture as a constant rather than an initiative, reinforcing desired cultural behaviors on an ongoing basis. Seek employee input on culture and ways to support it. Keep tabs on subcultures and work to maintain alignment between subcultures and the larger organizational culture. Be patient, allotting plenty of time when you're seeking to shift culture, and be selective about culture change and realistic about how much change employees can handle at any given time. So during the webinar, we've used APQC's 2 culture research projects to showcase ways to understand, shape, sustain, and shift organizational culture. I hope we've provided you with information that will be useful in the culture work that you do in your organizations. Perhaps you will use ethnographic methods, as Than talked about earlier in the presentation. Perhaps you'll tap into cultural levers, or be on the lookout for cultural derailers. So now Than and I would like to take your questions as well as your comments. So if you haven't already, please go ahead and submit those, and we will be happy to answer them. So Than, I'm going to start out with some questions that came in when you were speaking.
Sure.
The first one is, how might you use both ethnographic methods and something like an employee engagement survey together? What would you recommend? What might that look like?
Yeah, I think this is a really great question. And I think you absolutely can use those 2 things together. One case study that we have in our resource library that is good for painting a picture of what this could look like is about Lincoln Financial. It's called How Lincoln Financial Grew in Engagement During a Pandemic. And it talks about how the organization uses these engagement surveys to really find out about employee needs in the organization. And then when they discover something, they then drill in with, they use a more targeted survey at that point. So for example, when they found that at the beginning of the pandemic, a lot of parents are stressed out. They're dealing with a lot with their children. So I could see in a case like that using interviews, focus groups, even just sitting with them for a day and seeing what their day is like. So if The engagement survey, if you think about being in an airplane, gives you kind of the cruising altitude view of culture and shows you where you might want to land, where you might want to dig more deeply. And then once you find those hot spots or those challenge areas or those needs, you can use ethnographic methods to really go deep with people.
Great, thank you.
Mhm.
Another question that came in while you were speaking was, what determines if historical people are relevant to the current culture? Do current leaders need to be similar to Jack, for example? How do you determine if the historical leadership and culture is not currently relevant? If you could talk just a little bit about maybe how this happened at APQC.
Yeah, another great question. Thank you. And in some ways that I didn't necessarily talk about, our leaders are not like Jack, and that's a good thing. So change does need to happen. The next leader probably should not be exactly like the previous leader, and change does need to come. So for example, senior employees talked about how Jack would leave messages for people at like 2 or 3 in the morning. Just always working, total dynamo. But by the time they became leaders, they didn't want that same kind of just continual, they wanted more of a work-life balance, right? So, but then the broader question is, how will you know when things like leaders or an organization's history are now important for culture? And I think it really does go back to your strategy. Who do you want to be? Which way, which directions do you want to move the organization in? And often I think history and tradition are really helpful for reconnecting with who you are as an organization when you want to make those big moves. But if it's not, it really is just about your strategy and the cultural elements that are going to help you push that forward.
Great, thank you, Stan. The next is a question I'm going to take a stab at. The question is, if culture is too complex to be narrowed into a specific metric or benchmark, how are the best cultures being measured? And so when I talked about those kind of culture reports, we're seeing those contain both metrics that can be indicative of the health of an organization's culture, as well as a lot of qualitative information. So quotes from employees, examples of cultural experiences. So when it comes to metrics, we're seeing engagement rates, a look at voluntary turnover rates are things that are being used to gauge the health of an organization's culture, but also a lot of qualitative information that can be obtained, for example, through ethnographic research. So the next question that we have is, should the HR department be under the Chief Culture Officer? I think we're going to see a lot of movement in this area. I don't know if there's a definite should right now. One of the things that has come out for me in the research that we have done is the importance of having the Chief Culture Officer report into the CEO and elevating culture to that C-suite level. Certainly, as we talked about, HR plays a huge role in shaping an organization's culture. So there definitely is logic to having HR report under a Chief Culture Officer. And I think sometimes that's why we're seeing that the CHRO role be redesigned to be Chief People and Culture Officer, to kind of recognize the importance of HR in organizational culture. So the next question is, can you give examples of activities performed by the influencers and whisperers? How are they different? So influencers, I see as people who, like, for example, we said knowledge management and process prevention professionals who, as part of their job, are trying to influence employees to behave in certain ways. But whisperers I see as taking it to another level, because in order to do knowledge and process work, just in the course of that work, you're getting very involved in how employees are doing their jobs, why they work in certain ways. And this kind of knowledge is very useful for determining the best ways to influence different groups of people. So Whispers is really taking it a step further with using deep knowledge about people in organizations to customize how you're influencing those people. Another question is, what are some approaches that can be used to merge and change different cultures as a result of M&A? It's an awesome question. We actually are going to be doing some M&A research, so more to come definitely on this topic, because this is a very large and distinct area, I think, of culture change. I think one of the things, from putting on my HR hat, is just really having HR or the chief culture officer, if you have one, involved very early on in the M&A process, and using an evaluation of cultures as part of making that M&A decision, and really from the get-go planning what you're going to need to do to merge those cultures, and what that ultimate merge culture will look like. Okay, I think we can do one more question, and we will, if there are going to be questions that we haven't gotten to, so we'll go ahead, Dan and I, and answer those questions, and we will include them in a follow-up email to attendees. So the last question is, in this context, if subcultures exist, are they considered only as culture derailers, or can they reinforce the desired organizational culture? I don't know, Dan, if you wanted to say anything, I certainly can take this as well.
I would just say, yeah, just on the face of it, I don't think they're either derailers or supporters. They could be either. Yeah, there's nothing that shows us that they're automatically bad for broader organizational culture. Often they do help to support it and grow it.
Sure. And I think it's, the derailer is when we don't pay attention or acknowledge those subcultures within our organizations, and just keep a check that they are growing and staying aligned with the broader organizational culture, rather than becoming kind of separate cultural entities that are at odds with the broader organizational culture. So we are about out of time. I want to share with you contact information for Than and I. Please reach out if you have comments or questions. We'd love to hear from you. And I do want to let you know that you will be receiving a copy of the slides as well as the recording. We will also, in that follow-up email, include links to some of the content that we mentioned today on the webinar. And I just would like to remind you to check out our events page and see what upcoming events APQC has in store for you, and to follow us on social media. So thank you so much for joining the webinar today. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.